Welcome to yes, this thing is still going on edition. We are now in our weekly recap of what's been going down in Mythic Plus and in the Raid in Season 4 after the launch of Mr. Pandaria Remix, which I'm sure must have taken the attention and the time of many players. However, we still have a bunch of players still into this season. It's also kind of nice to be able to continue to play Season 4 while checking out all of the planned/intended changes for the War Within for each and every spec, so that the players currently playing in Season 4 can give the feedback on what terrible of a state their current spec is and the changes they might want to see in the next expansion. Kind of hard to do that if everyone is busy playing Mr. Pandaria Remix up until before the expansion launches. So this was the result of the DPS up until last week, the Fortified Afflicted Raging Week in Mythic Plus in Season 4. We have, at this point, our usual known affiliates, the worst at top being Shadow Priest and Destruction Warlock, together with a few others we have now seen stably here in Season 4, like Marksmanship Hunter, which we might not have expected last season. Also, Unholy Death Knight can take part of that group. Surprisingly, I guess we can call this the surprise of the week. We see Assassination Rogue. Now, this is not a usual position for Assassination. They have not exactly been known as some powerhouse of Mythic Plus. They didn't used to have too good of a time for pretty much, the entirety of the season, much like last season. If we move over to the meta, the new challenge for today is try to find Assassination in this list. Well, you can read Outlaw, even the full name for most of the Season 3. In Season 2, it starts to get hard to even get the Rogue, and if you see a Rogue, it's Subtlety, and in Season 1 is Subtlety or Outlaw. Yeah, you don't get to see Assassination pretty much ever. So the fact that we have some surprising performance this last week of Assassination is interesting. We do know, of course, as we have reported on this, that Assassination was buffed a couple of resets ago with the plus 6% damage to abilities and attacks. So it looks like they did quite better this last week. Definitely still not a very popular spec if you look at the amount of runs reported in the high-ish key range, 13 plus, all the way up to 17 keys. It is still not very many rogues playing. In fact, they are the lowest represented spec all the way down before Affliction. They are not very popular. Now, back to the diversity. Now, I'm not too angry about this, right? We have praised last season, especially for being reasonably, okay, not amazingly, but reasonably varied in the option and choices, especially when it came to the DPS and the healers for the first part, especially of the season. The only part where we were a little bit more concerned were the tanks. However, this season has not exactly gone nearly as well, because healers have started to gain more and more of a dominance of Resto Druid. Tanks continued, unfortunately, despite our pleas in seeing some changes, i.e. nerfs, for Vengeance, they did not really come. The nerfs they received were nowhere close to actually making them any weaker compared to other tanks, so their dominance has extended, and this season the lopsidedness, whether this is a word or not, it conveys the point. The lopsidedness of DPS has gotten even worse, because now Shadow Priest is nearly a third of all of the DPS entries in your Mythic Plus groups. And unfortunately, the horror, the abomination, the menace of augmentation is also coming back. We were rejoicing ever since their introduction and the disaster of the Exodia season of Season 2. We were rejoicing in Season 3 as they slowly lost more and more and more representation over time. Augmentation got completely battered by many nerfs. It looked like their time was over. Some players were even hoping that for the next expansion, augmentation were to be redesigned as a DPS spec and Blizzard would give up on the idea of a support spec for the next expansion. Apparently, now we are getting back to the days where augmentation is quite good. And what makes it even worse is that back when Exodia existed, the combo of augmentation was with Fire and Shadow. Yes, we had different tank and healer combo. We had Guardian, Holy Paladin as a combo. Now we have Augmentation, Fire and Shadow with Vengeance and Resto Druid. So that is slightly different, but the combo of the DPS is quite still the same. You have, of course, massive synergies. You have Vengeance buffing your magical damage by 5%, and you're bringing magical damage, magical damage, magical damage. So they go quite well together. The combination of the Augmentation defensiveness, their 2-minute cooldown, Breath of Eons, Absorb Shield, the Mass Absorb Shield of a Mage, why not the Vampiric Embrace of a Shadow Priest, give you even more tankiness in a Mythic Plus group. So that is unfortunately what we seem to be having for the moment, a return in Mythic Plus of Augmentation. We still see at large the popularity of Red Paladin, definitely, even in quite high keys in terms of most popular groups. Red is still quite visible, just like Destro. Still popping up quite often, as well as BM Hunter. If we go back to the meta, you still see especially Red holding up in terms of popularity. As always, this is worth mentioning, this is for the higher level of keys. It's for more, the more competitive side of key ranges. This total absurd dominance of Vengeance doesn't look nearly as awful if you look at all key levels in Mythic Plus, right? It's only a third of tanks being Demon Hunters, not 93%. Same goes for healers, This ridiculous dominance of Resto Druid looks much more balanced at all key level. As usual, at this point, it shouldn't surprise anyone. The ranged DPS still see Beast Mastery Hunters as the most popular spec, even though if we look at the actual top keys, Beast Mastery is, 0.8% of BM Hunters compared to all key levels. We have to start going into 10 keys and upwards to start seeing BM getting passed by Shadow Priest, and then 15 and upwards to see the complete disappearance of BM Hunters. Much like if we go in melee, only pretty much Red becomes a viable choice, and if we go into tanks, of course, Vengeance starts reaching the 90% mark. Same goes for Resto Druid and for healers. So as usual, worth pointing out that this combo is mostly just for the very, very high key level. And don't get confused, if you start seeing lacking and missing healers in these comps, these are not actually missing healers, these are Resto Druids finishing the key or starting the key as balance, because usually you can complete certain type of keys with massive large AoE pools and bringing up your healer as a 4th DPS for the initial pool, generally speaking. So many of these will be flagged as a balance druid, but actually in reality it's a Resto Druid. We also have something to say about the state of raiding in this season. We are now gotten past the 4th Awakened week, which was the 2nd round of Vault of the Incarnates. This is perhaps the more interesting one, because week 1 of Vault of the Incarnates was of course still quite unbalanced, right? The raid was quite tough. We had something like 40 guilds only defeating Razageth on week 1. Players were still very underleveled, not many players were still quite undergeared, and not many players even had their full 4-piece set bonus of the new season. But now we came back in Vault of the Incarnates after almost a month, so we get to see the full power of the specs in this raid. We do have something we touched on the first week we went through this, which was how Marksmanship Hunter would have worked quite well with the boss damage profile of Vault, and we saw at the end of last week, indeed, Marksmanship Hunter did work quite well in Vault of the Incarnates. If we have to find something unique about this Vault of the Incarnates result, is perhaps the better results overall of melee specs. Because if you look at the top, right, you have Marksmanship and you have Devastation. But then you have Arms, you have Unholy, you have Windwalker, Havoc, Rat, Assassination, Frost DK. So, a whole bunch of melee, basically, performing better. Look at this. Look at how smoothly paired together all of the bottom specs are, including the Warlocks, the Druids, the Shamans, the Mages. Most of these melee specs have been performing quite well in Vault of the Incarnates. The other rankings, even the currently active Awakened Aberus, are slightly different. You have a Mage in here, Shadow Priest, Warlocks also get up in the top rankings compared to the results in Vault. Good to see, as we mentioned, from the buffs having a positive effect. Assassination being buffed, having a much better performance this week around in Vault. There wasn't just DPS, of course, in terms of results, there was also the healing. We touched on this the first time about how much more even and difficult to gauge the power of these healers it was, because if you look at the actual, HPS numbers, the gap in the HPS was quite close, with the one exception, right, being Holy Paladin. The gap between the 6th healer and the 1st healer is only 10,000 HPS. We're talking about 3%. So this one is one of the worst ones, and it's only doing 3% worse than the better performing one. So effectively there is no difference, right? Effectively they are all perfectly capable of doing nice healing or of being competitive in the raid. The only one slightly off is Holy Paladin, who is performing slightly worse. It isn't even just a case of Holy Paladin being underplayed and not, many top players still playing Paladin, because even in the Parses, Holy still has a decent representation, so it's not that they are lacking the player base to do well, they are just straight up doing worse than the other healers. And this was something that we already saw the week before this, the week before Vault in Amirjasil, where you had again the gap between 6th and 1st being some 17,000 HPS compared to the much larger gap from Holy Paladin to the best healer in Amirjasil. In Vault is somewhat similar. Obviously, at this point, none of this is that relevant given the not very try-hard theme of this season, being a shorter season, plus not really having much of anything new being put into this season. As mentioned, the most important part of this season is to be able to continue, continue to play these specs as you get closer to the War Within expansion, to give feedback on what possible changes you might be wanting for your spec in the next expansion. Like, as we mentioned, perhaps the state of Holy Paladin in the current version of the game, and their problems of having to decide between a caster build and a melee build, as well as the complete uselessness of their spenders. Light of Dawn and Word of Glory, a few other problems like the currently under construction rework of both Demo and Destro, and a few other things. So that's what this is more relevant for, not really for the current meta state of the specs in the raid or in Mythic Plus, but more so about what could possibly change coming into the next expansion. So for today, this was the weekly recap of the situation in the meta of PvE activities, namely being the raid and Mythic Plus. So for today, on this Thursday, it's time to leave each other. We're starting the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, also be given completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, it's been raining. It's been raining for a while. I don't mind it. I don't mind the soothing, chilling background sound of the rain coming down.